Hello, and welcome to today's webcast on how to overcome 4 major tension points in the conventional HR model with speakers from AlignOrg Solutions. I'm Barbara Lombardo, a program director and research fellow at the Conference Board, and I'm pleased to serve as your moderator today. Our speakers today are going to first provide you with some context, some key trends in HR. They're then going to introduce the CUBE model of organizational alignment, and that comes from their book, Mastering the Cube, A Leader's Guide to Orchestrating Complex Organizational Change. They'll then go on and describe for you the 4 major tension points in the conventional HR operating model and some potential solutions to them. They'll finally close with a summary, some applications, and of course, Q&A. Today's webcast will be interactive. We'll have a potential poll. There'll be some reflection questions for you to think about. And of course, as I said, there'll be Q&A as well. So when you have questions, you'll put them in the Q&A box, which I'll show you in just a moment. So before we begin, just a few reminders, and these will be emphasizing some of what you saw in the video at the beginning of the webcast. First, if you would like to earn credit for your attendance, you can download a proof of attendance certificate, and you can see that icon where you can do that. And then you can submit that certificate to whatever certification provider that you use to receive your credits. Next, and again, just a reminder, put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll do our very best to make sure that we pose those to the speakers before the conclusion of the webcast. And then there's also a download resources icon that you can click on to download resources available to you that are related to today's webcast. So with that, I'm really pleased to introduce to you our speakers today, both Reed Deshler, who's a principal advisor at AlignOrg Solutions, and Keily Breeden, an engagement executive at AlignOrg Solutions.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Reed and I are so excited to be here. It's so great to see familiar faces and friends and colleagues. For those of you who aren't familiar with AlignOrg Solutions, let me just give you a quick introduction. We are a management consultancy firm that specializes in organizational design. And what we really do is work with organizations to think about their strategy and what differentiates them in the marketplace, and then design the organization around that to really drive that focus. With that, we work on change leadership and what we call leadership alignment to make sure that leadership team is really in lockstep to drive that differentiation and implement that org structure. So in a nutshell, that is kind of most of the projects. 80% of the projects that we work with on clients is to do just that. The other 20% is really around capability building. So conferences, webinars like this one, and capability building within an internal, maybe HR team. So that's kind of the mix of the work that we do at AlignOrg Solutions. And in addition to that, we're really kind of lifelong learners. We are a group of consultants who have been in the industries, many of us have kind of sat in HR or business leader roles in industries, but we also like to cast a wide net and really learn from really great organizations. We know that our HR colleagues, particularly at Fortune 100 companies, face some similar challenges, and so we like to do a lot of research to make sure we are hearing and have our ear to the ground of your great learnings, and in trainings like this, hearing from you as well. So with that, I think you've covered what we'll talk about. Let's look at a couple of HR trends. HR trends that we're seeing, and we all see the same, industry surveys that are so interesting and have really evolved over the last few years. But in particular, over the last years, we've worked with clients. These are a couple of buckets that we want to look at that have emerged for us. Talent, of course, continues to be kind of front of mind for everyone, whether it's attracting, engaging, retaining the top talent that you want keep your eye on. In addition to that, I think another thing that we see a lot of clients really trying to understand and tackle is, where do we find not only the technologies, but the data? How do we get the rich data that we need to leverage? How do we use the technologies when so many of these systems are kind of disparate and spread across the organization? What's the best way to really find the right analytics to drive, the HR agenda? And of course, it's hard not to mention ways of working, because ways of working has changed so much. But how does that technology and data even enable ways of working? And how does all of that support the talent that we're trying to attract and retain? And I think the last bucket that we really are spending a lot of time on with clients is that culture. How do we create that winning and really purposeful culture? We all hear and see that people really want to work somewhere that's purpose driven, or that fits with their values, or where there are people who look like me or think like me, or think differently from me. And how do we embrace that diversity in our cultures, and making part of this culture not just kind of a program, but a way of life? So all of these really kind of flow together. And then finally, organizational transformation. It's not often that we run into a company who hasn't been in the midst of a transformation for a while. I guess it happens every once in a while, but for the most part, I think change has, become the new way of life for years. So how do we, as HR professionals, really sit at the table and help drive that innovation? I think we just are at a unique place as an HR, unit, to think about these things differently. Unfortunately, I think some of our own HR structure and model gets in the way, and that's a little bit about what we'll talk about today. But we'd love to hear other themes from you, or the things that are front of mind for you. We'd love to see those in the chat. If we've missed something, that we didn't list here, that's front of mind.
Hey, Keily, this is Reed. I'm going to jump in and just build on what you've shared so far. That was a great setup. And, as others start to comment in the chat box, when we put together some recent writings on this topic, we acknowledge that there are many other key trends and themes going on. But for our purposes today, and to kind of set the stage, we really wanted to focus on these three areas around talent, the ways of working, and analytics, of course, and then culture and organization. So I think you've done a nice job setting that up. And as we go through this conversation, hopefully you're reflecting not just in what we're sharing and what we're saying, but also thinking back to your own organization or the organization that you work with, and asking some questions like, are these the trends that are impacting us, or are there other ones? And if so, how effective is our HR operating model at dealing with and adapting to these situations? And I think as you reflect on those questions, you'll probably find some areas where things are working well and some things where it might not be working so well. I looked at some research this morning, in fact, that suggests that within the last couple of years, many HR teams have gone through some kind of redesign or restructuring. And yet, over 35% of those are thinking about doing it again, which I find fascinating to think about that, because if you just got finished with it, why would you need to do it again? Now, there's a lot of reasons why that could be. I mean, the world's changing super fast, right? But these trends are significant. So as we go forward here in our conversation, we want to kind of have a framework from which we kind of share our perspective. And we call it the cube model of organization alignment. As Barbara mentioned at the outset, we wrote about this and sort of put it forward back many years ago in our book, Mastering the Cube. And essentially, it's a framework which I'll start with more of the academic kind of explanation of it, and then I'll give you a really practical sort of way to talk about it with your colleagues and even with business leaders that you might interface with. Whenever we look at an organization, there's always a question of, what are we trying to get or accomplish? And so you'll notice here in this graphic that's appeared on the screen on the far right, you see results. Because ultimately that's at the end what we're trying to achieve, hopefully good results, whatever those might be. It might be better employee engagement. It might be higher sales. It might be success in a market, whatever it might be. And as you kind of work your way backwards through this diagram, you end up on the far left side of it, going back to the marketplace, the environment in which all organizations operate, where the rules get set, where customers and stakeholders sort of describe what matters to them. And based on what is happening in the market, in the environment, organizations determine what strategies they want to pursue. As they determine their strategy, they start to say, what organizational capabilities do we have to be really good at to win? Think of it almost like muscles in the human body. If I want to compete as a football player, American football that is, then I would build different muscle groups and do different training regimens than if I was trying to be a ballerina. And in a similar way, organizations, once they determine the path they want to chart for themselves, have to build different muscles. And that leads to the whole set of organizing choices that have to be aligned or ought to be aligned to drive effective performance. As practitioners, we often talk about the strategy piece as about the effort to clarify your intent, how you want to win, and those trade-offs that are essential. Those are obviously going to have organizational implications. That's where your capabilities derive from. You can't just declare we're going to be best at something and then not commit to building the muscles to win there. And then finally, when you start to get down to the more tactical organizing choices, you do have different levels of choices to make. Some are macro level design choices, and some are micro level design choices, more operational in nature. Now, what unifies this thinking is the cube model. And yes, we stole from the Rubik's Cube metaphor because it was such a great metaphor. When you look at a Rubik's Cube or manipulate or play with one, you realize that you can't turn one side of it and not affect the rest of the model. And in a similar way, and it may be a little hard to see here on the screen, each side of the cube for us represents an important organizational dimension, like the work of the organization, the structure, the people and rewards, the information and metrics, leadership and culture, and improvement processes. All of those things represent key aspects of how an organization works that impacts performance. So as we cycle back now to this topic around the HR operating model, part of what we're trying to essentially do is look at the HR operating model through the lens of the cube and ask ourselves, is the HR operating model that we're trying to win and compete and enable our organization with capable of winning? Do we do work in a way that's going to enable flexibility and agility? Are we structured in such a way that roles are clear and that people can effectively make decisions quickly and support business questions? Do we have good performance scorecards? Do we have the right talent in the right places, and so on and so forth? And as I mentioned, we've written extensively about this to try to help provide this framework so that leaders really have a tangible sort of metaphor that they can use as they ask themselves, why is our organization winning, or why is it not winning? Now, I'm going to jump into the first sort of tension point, but Keily, did you have something you wanted to add here before we move on?
Sorry, I couldn't unmute. No, I did not. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Very good. So as we've stood back and talked with countless organizations and the clients that we work with, we're starting to see some issues in the traditional HR operating model. Now, when you say traditional, what does that mean? Because there isn't one size fits all. But many HR organizations have adopted sort of the Ulrich HR operating model that came out 25, 30 years ago in HR Champions, where you have an HR business partner component, you have a COE or centers of expertise component, and you have HR operations component. And as we've looked at that model, there's a lot of goodness that comes from that model. And so if you're in that model, the message today is not jettison that or throw it away. Our message is to say, I bet you're dealing with some tension points, some issues with it. Maybe growing pains could be a way to talk about it. So we're going to talk about those tension points. And the first tension point that we want to put on the table is essentially around HR leadership. when you look at the head of HR, in many organizations, we find an HR executive who is being forced to wear a couple of important hats. The first hat is that they are often the advisor, the senior most human capital, human resource, people advisor to the executives of the organization. So when a CEO or when the C-suite has a question about what should our policy be on a key people-related topic, or how are we going to build the kind of leadership needed for the next iteration or generation of the business, those are questions where the head of HR is often sort of pulled in as the senior HR business partner. If that were all they did, I would bet many of our HR executives could be highly effective and efficient. The reality is they wear at least another significant hat, which is they are a function leader. In many large Fortune 100 companies, HR, even though we all may bemoan the fact that we don't have enough resources, are often several hundred people organizations that are all deployed globally trying to support the HR function. So as you can imagine, as an HR executive, you get up on Monday morning and you say, okay, I'm going to go make a difference this week. And you have a whole litany of meetings to go do, some of which are about the future and where you're taking the business. And you're partnering with with business executives to help think about the implications, talk through ways you want to approach it, maybe even come up with differentiated strategies. And then you're drawn into a bunch of meetings related to how are we going to run our function? Are we on budget? Why aren't we performing better here? Why are we getting complaints from employees or managers asking for things that as a function we're being ineffective at delivering? As you can appreciate, a whole different set of problems for the HR executive to deal with. Now, we're not here to say there's an easy answer for this problem, but as we've sat back and talked to some colleagues, we are seeing a greater willingness in some ways to divide the responsibilities of the HR executive. Now, what we're about to say is just an example. Please don't take this as thou shalt go do this. If you're the CHRO sitting on this call thinking, wait a minute, I just got cut in half, that's not necessarily the message. But what we do want to provoke is some thought about how do you make it effective for the HR executive to play both roles. And we have seen some situations where the CHRO, for example, might continue to be that key contact with the executives of the organization. And another role is created or elevated, or a person is designated to serve as sort of the chief operating officer of the HR function, thus allowing for the day-to-day running of the function to occur by someone else. Again, not the answer, but an attempt to acknowledge that in the traditional HR operating model that many are functioning in, we have positioned our executives to be somewhat, bipolar in a sense, where they have to be strategic and away from the function half the time, and then drawn back into the day-to-day operating of the function the other half of the time. And we think that there are some solutions for how you organize work, how you define the roles, and how you might hold people accountable and measure success, and even look at the skill sets required. And as you hear me rattle those off, hopefully in the back of your mind, you're thinking of the cube model we just talked about: the work, the structure, the performance expectations, the talent and skills required. And so this is sort of the first tension point and possible solution we wanted to put forward. I'm going to turn it to Keily now, and she's going to kind of dive into the second one.
Great, thank you, Reed. So the next one is thinking about the center of expertise. So perhaps right-sizing what might be an overbuilt center of expertise. So I've spent about 25 years in HR. Half of my career was in centers of expertise, and the other half was as an HR business partner. So this one's kind of near and dear to my heart. Some of these things also ring true, but the purpose of that center of expertise is to build that capability and have the thought leadership and research team or group of experts to really drive whatever it is, if it's talent management or learning and development or leadership development, something like that. But what can happen is, depending on the size or depending on the workload, there can be too much improvement. Continuous improvement is really important, of course, but how much improvement is really required? For instance, if you're working on an annual process, think maybe like performance management or talent reviews or something like that, are constant tweaks really necessary? But perhaps if the team is overbuilt, that's what happens, is you start to think about ways to improve. And when you have a group of experts, they're probably naturally researching, wanting to improve. So thinking about how much improvement is really enough. The next thing to think about is operational scope creep. So when you're thinking about that center of expertise, was it really built to build a capability, even like a change management or learning and development type of capability in the organization, or was it built to actually go do that capability? Sometimes we'll find that really the center of expertise was built to build the muscle, that initial muscle, but not necessarily to be the doers. Perhaps it's to build the muscle and then teach the rest of the HRBP team or teach leaders to do something, but have that smaller COE who's really kind of overseeing at the top level and let the hands and feet be out amongst the organization. But if the COEs become overbuilt, it's easier to take on that work and just do it yourself. And it's kind of a chicken and the egg, right? You've got a great team who's ready and willing to do things, and then you've got a need. So you have a group of people who want to do it, but is that really the most value add, or is the value add to build the expertise and help deploy that through the organization in a different way? And then you think about the cost that comes with that. You know, the saying in HR is a dollar spent in HR is a dollar not spent somewhere else in the business. So, you know, if HR is certainly usually a cost center. So if the budget's there and you have the team to do the work, oftentimes you get, I think, caught up in wanting to add value when business leaders come and ask you to help with work that may be outside of the scope. And again, what's the cost of that work? So these are just some of the things that, you know, we wanted to offer as food for thought as you think about your COEs. I think a couple of possible solutions, if you really just think at that very top level, is when you're thinking about setting up that COE, or if you've already set up a COE, what's the cycle? Is there a planning cycle that you want to think about? Is this a policy that you're putting out that probably needs to be revisited maybe every few years? Is this a process that probably needs to be updated once or twice every 5 years, probably not once a quarter? I think, you know, when you think about sitting in a COE, and, you know, early in my career, I led performance management for many years. And it's really easy to do a lot of research and come up with tweaks and, you know, find different ways of doing performance management when most leaders didn't really want to have a new tweak every year, because it was a new process for them to learn and a new way of doing it. They just wanted a standard process to follow, have the conversation, and move on. So I think it's easy to get kind of in the mindset of this is really important and moving, and it is really important. Among a lot of other HR strategies that are important. So I think confirming the potential investments with the business leaders also, you know, again, we have a group of people who are very smart and innovative, but making sure that what you're delivering fits with the HR strategy and fits with the business goals is critical. And along with that is remaining focused on the value. I think part of it is taking a lesson from our technology counterparts, right? If a project comes into technology, they want the business case and what's the ROI. But oftentimes in HR, that's not a discipline that we follow. So how can we make sure we're monetizing that request, or really looking at the capability or work we're trying to build against the landscape within HR? All right. And the next one we're going to talk about is the HR business partner's scope. And a lot of time we see this as the strategic HR business partner. And so that strategic work for the HR business partner, when you think about it, it's that talent development and deployment, organizational effectiveness, leadership coaching. But what tends to happen is that day-to-day transactional work happens, and it kind of chokes out the strategic work that you really, the HR business partner really wants to spend their time on, and your leaders really want you to spend your time on. And I think this one, as HRBPs, it kind of makes me chuckle. If you're working with your leaders and you're helping them think about their organization, and as Reed talked about the cube, where do you start? You start with the work. And so you have you talk through your leaders, you talk through the work that's required, and you coach them not to put transactional work with strategic work in the same role, because what happens? The strategic work doesn't happen. You get focused on the transactional work. Yet here we are in the HRBP role doing just, what we would typically coach leaders not to do. I always look at that kind of that bottom of that funnel, and I think just a food for thought is when you start to feel that bottleneck, and as the HRBP, when you start to feel the bottleneck happening, maybe the scope is a little off balance for you. If you're becoming that bottleneck, where is it that you're spending time that maybe you wish you wouldn't or you shouldn't be, where you should be spending time somewhere else? We could probably have a whole session just probably on the HRBP tension points. But I think as we think about that, and some things that we've seen, a possible solution is trying to pull apart, much like the CHRO role that Reed talked about, kind of pulling apart some of that work so you can focus on it differently. And that could be pulling it off into different roles. It could be, this says ER specialist, but if you think about more of an HR generalist, or even sometimes a shared service who's picking up some of that transactional work off of an HR business partner's plate and letting you focus on that strategic work, that's one possible solution that we've thought of. I think with this one, though, comes a lot of change management, maybe with the business leaders, because the business leaders expect the HR partner to know all of the answer to all of these things and the status of all of this transactional work as well. So really helping communicate who's spending time on what, who your point of contact is, because your leaders really want one point of contact, and how you can get some of this work spread a little more evenly, so the HR experts can look at the individual skills and you can really maximize those.
Keily, I wanted to jump in real quick if I could before we move to tension point 4, and just acknowledge a couple of the things that you've touched on, because I think that as we think about these 2 tension points around COEs and about HR business partners, you've had all the key parts of this, but I think maybe the one thing that we've underestimated or underrepresented so far is that there are some, I'm going to use the term insidious challenges that can happen. So for example, if I'm an HR business partner and I'm caught up in this balancing of day-to-day transactional activities, as well as trying to play a strategic advisory role, I can become very, dissatisfied, frustrated with my inability to be effective. Mm-hmm. I can't do any of it that well because I'm always behind or whatever. And so you end up with an employee engagement challenge, which by design was never meant to be the problem, but it starts to manifest itself. I think another maybe insidious side effect is that perhaps we end up with functions like a COE making up work to do to stay busy if they have created sort of an entitlement around their budget and headcount. Because if you don't keep everyone busy, then why would you keep the headcount? Why would you keep the budget? And in a function, it is so important to, sort of use your resources effectively. And so you can fall into these traps, which were never designed to be the case. We intended to be strategic, we intended to be agile, we intended to be customer focused, but the operating model has some of these natural tension points that can lead to some of these insidious outcomes. And I apologize for using that really negative term, but the notion is they're unintended, and the notion is they can actually be somewhat detrimental to people's engagement and to the overall effectiveness and credibility of the function. So I just wanted to kind of add that point.
Well, and I think these two tension points together, the HRBPs and the COEs, you know, that's a great, there's typically some kind of handoff. If the HRCOE is building a capability and handing it off for the HRBP to deploy, that's great, but it's a one-to-many relationship. So you've got your HRBP who's got all these COEs who's doing the same thing, and that funnel gets just kind of a little more packed with what has to move through it.
That's a great point. Well, on that note, let's hit our fourth tension point, and this one inevitably has to touch on HR operations and technology. And I should probably just use those as not synonymous, but as conjoined twins, because the notion is that HR operations is the place where a lot of the transactional administrative activities of the function should be occurring. And where possible, we should be automating or enabling through self-service technology as much of that work as possible. What we find, however, is that while the dream of that reality is out there and talked about and hoped for from many, many HR executives and teams, the reality is we often find that's quite underdeveloped. And so a phenomenon that we've seen a few times is we've helped organizations redesign their HR operating models is a situation where in today's world, a lot of the resources sit in either the equivalent of the COEs or in the field, sort of in the HR business partner realm. And now we introduce let's get HR operations stood up. Let's introduce the technology to really enable our processes. And what happens is we kind of then have to say, well, where are we going to get the resources for HR operations? Well, the only two sources really, unless someone's going to give you a whole bunch more people, is going to be to turn to your COEs or to your business partners and say, we've got to sort of pull some of those resources out to create HR operations. Needless to say, that's a pretty Herculean task. And we've seen a lot of HR transformations sort of fall flat because for whatever reason, the business partners can't give up or the COEs can't give up the resources to fulfill the promise of HR operations. Now, despite that reality, we also acknowledge that at the end of the day, HR teams and leaders should kind of have in their mind an image of where they want to see the resources of the HR function allocated to. Now, we're going to show you a highly simplistic view of this, but let me give an illustration. I guess one way you could do it, and this is the way it's often drawn when you see it, is almost like a Venn diagram where you have your business partners, your COEs, and your HR operations, all equally sized little components of the HR operating model, as depicted here on the page. But if you think about it, what you've created with that sort of equally balanced Venn diagram is a perfectly balanced model that creates a lot of tension. Who makes decisions? Who executes processes? Who has the resource for something? Who do we go to get something done? And what we're starting to see is a little bit more nuance needing to be required. And so I've put an alternative here on the screen. It's a little bit smaller. But in this alternative, this is an HR operating model that still has the three components, but there is a conscious decision to allocate the resources to the COEs and to HR operations and to sort of really streamline and thin down HR business partnering. Now, what does that mean? Well, that probably means that you have fewer HR business partners who are there to do only strategic advisory and brokering types of activities, which means that all the other day-to-day executional things have to happen somewhere else, either in the COEs or in HR operations. We're not here to say, that's the perfect way to do it, but it is a way to sort of put into a more operating rhythm a kind of balance of resources where would decisions get made in this model? Well, likely more with the COEs because they're substantial in size, they have resources, they probably are the process owners for a lot of the key people processes in the business. Where does execution happen? Most of it's probably going to happen in the HR operations and technology realm, with the HR business partners then being a thin advisory group. Now, you could do another alternative where in this picture, you can see the sizes have shifted. Business partners are more substantial. HR operations is fairly substantial, but the muscle, the engine to build, create, own processes, innovate, and so forth is much smaller. This organization is facing off effectively with their client groups. They've got a machine to execute processes, but a fairly small sort of process ownership development type of capability. Again, why would you choose this model versus alternative one? Lots of reasons. Perhaps you're a more mature HR organization. You don't have to keep building from scratch new processes or programs. Maybe a lot of those already exist, and it's really now just maintenance mode. Whereas in alternative one, perhaps you're in more of a build phase of your development. The final alternative does what you would expect. It keeps a fairly strong HR business partnering presence, strong COEs, but a much smaller HR operations and technology space. Why would this work? Again, it might be that because you're so geographically dispersed, it's hard to scale and to standardize all of the work and processes that you'd like to. So you can do it with a few things, but you still need a fair amount of arms and legs out helping to support the business. We're not here to say pick 1, 2, or 3, although we in a minute would like to do a little poll to see kind of where you think your resources are today allocated. But I do think the question that we ought to be asking ourselves is, if we're going to have sort of this traditional HR operating model with the BPs, the COEs, and HR operations, have we effectively designed and built out our HR operations? Or are we kind of starving them by not giving them the needed resources? And have we given appropriate consideration to the balance of resources that we want in our HR operating model? Because if we just leave it as equally divided, chances are we're just going to kind of step on one another and sort of argue about who has decision rights. But whereas if we consciously say, this is where we want our resource because this will help the business in the best and most effective ways, we might have some alternatives here. Now, as promised, we want to try to do a poll. I always say try to, because you never know for sure if it's going to work. But thinking about those alternatives that we just walked through, we'd love to see from the audience, from the perspective of, where are your team's resources currently allocated? So option 1 here says, hey, we're pretty evenly divided. We've got those 3 major components. We have resources fairly equally balanced among all 3. Option 2 is we have pretty strong and robust COEs and a pretty strong and robust HR operations with a thin HR business partner. The third option is strong BPs, strong HR operations, with a much smaller COE component. And finally, we have strong BPs, strong COEs with a fairly nominal or thin HR operations and technology component. So we'll give you just a minute for folks to respond. We're seeing the responses come in. We appreciate that. So we'll give just a minute to kind of see where everyone's at today. And while we're waiting on that, got a great comment from one of our participants who said there might even be a 5th alternative or maybe a 4th alternative, however we're counting them, which says maybe you've got a small BP, small COE, but a much larger HR operations, which I think is a great 4th alternative to consider. So I hope our message in doing this is not to say these are the only 3, but to say, this is a key question for HR executives to think about to try to help create the kind of balanced decision making and call it sort of smooth operating that is needed. We'll give you just one more minute. We're getting some great comments. One of the individuals commented that, what's the difference between HR operations and HR COEs? COEs tend to be the builders, the developers. HR operations tends to get stood up to execute. So in terms of training, for example, you would probably look at an L&D COE, for example, to identify what training is needed for leaders or for employees. They would probably do the instructional design and development. But then your HR operations would handle the scheduling of courses, the tracking of who's been to what courses, your LMS type of activities. So you often see the executional, the day-to-day stuff happening in HR operations and more of the development work in COEs. Having said that, we've also seen lots of cases where that's blended differently. Okay, we've got about a 60% response rate now. Thank you for taking the time. Here's kind of how it's come out. So interesting, right, Keily?
Yeah.
Were you surprised when you saw this?
A little, yeah.
Yeah. So as I would have thought, and as I've experienced in doing a lot of HR redesigns, I'm not surprised to see a fairly evenly balanced mix, right? Where all three components are kind of equal, all equal at the table. Also, option number 4, where we see strong VPs and strong COEs. That's what I would have predicted is often the case. It's hard to get that HR operations team off the ground because you are kind of pulling resources out of the traditional areas of HR, either the COE or HR business partners. So I really commend for those that are kind of in options B and C here, who have found ways to maybe strengthen, in one case, the BPs and HR operations, and in another case, the COEs and HR operations. Looks like we're getting lots of questions on this matter. So I'm just going to respond to one question that came in here. Appreciate the person who asked this. And it's really around HR operations as an ecosystem. And I think what I would say about this, and I'm reading into the question a little bit, sometimes when we think about HR operations, we assume that there is like an HR operations center where everybody kind of goes and sits, whether it be like in a contact center or in a factory almost. I don't think that that's necessarily, given the hybrid ways of working, given the technology we have available to us, given the geographic spread, that is necessarily how HR operations needs to or is often manifesting itself. I think really HR operations does focus or does operate much more in a decentralized or call it geographically spread model where resources can sort of be where they need to be. Technology is managing a lot of the work and processes, and there are linkages, there are decision rights, there are processes and policies that help sort of keep the HR operations part of HR functioning smoothly. So I don't know if I nailed the question exactly, but appreciate you asking that. I'm going to hand things back here in a minute to Keily, but as we kind of summarize what we've talked about, we've kind of stood back from this and said, these tension points exist. We can pretend they don't. Maybe they don't in your model because you've already addressed it in some way, but we do see it over and over again. And so as we've stood back and said, what do we do about this? We kind of said, do you reallocate some of the leadership, executive, managerial duties of the HR leader so that they can focus on the two hats they have to wear? Are there opportunities to streamline COEs that have become a little bit entitled and sort of built up and sort of maintaining the status quo? Do we need to have better processes for planning and cost discipline? Can we beef up our HR operations teams? using the right technology? Do we have the right allocation model for where we want our resources to be in our HR operating model? And I already mentioned technology. So these are just a few. I'm sure that there are people on the call today that have other suggestions, and we appreciate the comments that have been made. So let's go ahead and go here. I'm going to cycle us back to our model. You noticed I did remove the cube from this picture, but what I wanted to highlight here as we move to kind of a closeout and Q&A and some application is this, that some of the questions that need to be addressed around the HR operating model are organizational leadership, executive level type questions, maybe even beyond the HR function. What does the business expect of the function? How, as an HR executive team, do we want our operating model to really be set up to deliver value for the business? And then what we find is as we get deeper into how we do work, we start to delegate responsibility to the more tactical and operational micro level decisions that have to be made. And so we say, hey, we want HR operations, but as an HR chief operating officer or chief HR officer, I can't solve for all of that. I need people closer to that work to really help architect how that's going to happen. And that's where we see micro design teams come into play. And so what we don't want to do as we close this discussion is to assume, hey, if you just get your HR leadership team together, talk about these tension points, they'll solve it. They might provide the direction, the design principles, they might make some key trade-offs, they might help shape or set the parameters for the model. But ultimately, execution comes down to how effectively the processes, the roles, the scorecards, and so forth work. And that's where you need to involve other members of the HR team to be able to help execute and design how you want the operating model to indeed happen. Keely, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Great. All right. So we've seen a lot of great questions come through the chat, and please keep them coming. We just wanted to leave you with some personal reflection thoughts about thinking about your own operating model or your own HR model in your organization. What are the tension points that you're noticing or that you've been working through or maybe solved for? Feel free to drop them in the chat. Feel free to drop your solutions and share those with each other also. And then what approach do you take to help your leaders really tackle those gaps in the HR operating model? So how are you solving for gaps that you're seeing? Are there places that you need to invest more? And then I'm looking to see if there are any other questions that have come up. Give you guys just a few minutes with that. Barbara, have you seen maybe any questions that we have missed?
Keely, yes, there's one or two if we have time to address them. One has to do with the tension within two of your tension points, the one about the CHRO and the one about the business, the HR business partner, had to do with like tension between strategic demands and operational demands. Seems like a common, tension in almost any role. Question is, in your experience, are there people who do both well, or how much of it has to do with the person in the role and what they gravitate toward?
Yeah, I think that's interesting because it certainly is a balancing skill set, right? To really be able to shift from focusing on strategic and planning and helping leaders think for the future and then executing. And so, I think there are some people who do it really well. And I think there are some people who probably naturally gravitate one way or the other. And I think that's where when you move and you kind of pull that HRBP role apart a little bit and have that more strategic focus and like our possible solution, and then have those more tactical transactional groups, whether it's a shared service or an HR generalist or something like that. I think part of it, it depends on the requirement of the role, and then finding the right person where the skill set meets the role.
Right. So role fit. Yeah. There was another question, and
Barbara,
I think
can I jump in on the last one as well?
Please do. Yeah.
Yeah. Clearly, we know across any organizational design that a superhero with amazing skills can compensate for jobs that are just really big, right? And so there are cases where we see some HR executives do an amazing job of balancing those two hats among many others. But when you think about it from a sustainable, ongoing talent development perspective, to rely on finding that superhero to fill that role and try to wear both of those hats and do it effectively, I think is probably a little bit of wishful thinking and a bit of luck. And we would almost argue, why don't you look at more of design and how do you set up the role so that success can happen based on people's strengths?
Right. So implicit in your answer, it sounds like it is rather rare to find people who are equally good at, operational things and strategic things, whether it's a CHRO or an HR business partner.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, well said. We work with some organizations that are in the entrepreneurial space, and often the founder entrepreneur is a horrible operator and manager, right?
Classic example. Yeah. Another question, and Reed, I'm going to pose this to you because it has to do with something you said earlier in the webcast. When you were just beginning your remarks, you mentioned that you're seeing an acceleration of reorgs and reorg after reorg. And there's a question about, like, how do you know when it's time and when undertaking yet another reorg is going to be more of a distraction than an improvement?
Well, isn't that the $64,000 question?
Tell us, please.
Well, I wish I knew the definitive answer for it, but I do think there are some signs, right? And one of the things that I'm going to harken back to the cube model. To me, when we say we need to do a redesign of an HR operating model, for example, that implies to me that when we look at the cube, for example, there are misalignments across multiple sides of that cube. The work's misaligned, the structure and roles are misaligned, the performance measures are misaligned, the talent's misaligned, the culture leadership practices might be misaligned. That says there's enough going on, we need to sit back and rethink it. If in doing a little bit of introspection or even diagnosis, which we have an alignment index we help organizations go through, they can narrow down that there's issues, say, with just one or two sides of the cube, then I would look at that rather than a redo as, can we take what exists and sort of zero in on the pain points and make some adjustments? So that's kind of how I would answer it, that there's a bit of diagnosis that has to be done a little deeper than, hey, you've got a flesh wound here, but just how serious, deep is it really?
Right. Yeah. I think we have time for you to address maybe one or two more questions. So here's another one. You showed us in the different models, and you used examples that gave a suggestion that perhaps there's sort of an evolution that an organization would go through from one of those models, to another, like a sequence, maybe from startup, to maturation and growth. Is that the case? Do you tend to see organizations, go along some kind of predictable path as they grow and mature?
Keily, did you want to start with that one, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I was thinking about particularly, the circle slide and the center of expertise or center of excellence. And I think definitely you can see that through a maturity curve when the muscle hasn't been built and you need to introduce it in the organization. I would imagine you would see a lot of times then we see either contract resources to come in and help build a particular skill set or capability, or the building of that COE that eventually over time may need to be much smaller just in order to sustain. So I can certainly see that. And then I think maybe about, like, if you think about HR operations, as things are streamlined or technologies introduced, I can see that kind of waning down a little bit as well.
Right, because I think it was your second tension point where that COE gets kind of too big and unwieldy, and then that might be a time to kind of pull back.
Right.
Yeah. Reed, anything to add about that question? I was trying to avoid that maturity model phrase, but
No.
I think we all know what we mean by it. Is there that kind of an evolutionary path, or is that overly simplifying?
No, I think it's right. I think there are other drivers that potentially impact sort of the evolution of processes and functions. For instance, an acquisition. So if an organization brings in a large acquisition, there's going to be a challenge, right, to harmonize processes and policies. And that's not a maturity issue. That's just simply, how do we bring it into harmony now that we're a combined organization? So I think there are some other factors that go into that, right?
Makes sense. Yeah, thank you. I think that's about all the time we have for questions, and I want to thank the audience for your engagement and your really thoughtful questions. I know that Reed and Keily have a couple of summing up slides and remarks they want to share with you, and then I have a few on behalf of the conference board, and we'll make sure to close by the top of the hour.
Excellent. So everyone who's participating will receive our executive guide called Maximizing the HR Operating Model, which is a lot of what our discussion was based around. So you will, I think, receive that in your email through a link. And then I think all we have is just, I think this is our AlignOrg on LinkedIn. Follow us, and then I think I can flip it back over to you, Barbara.
Right.
Thank
if you
you.
want to go back to the slide that showed contact information for you and Reed,
Yes.
right there, just want to pause there for one moment in case our audience would like to record that and be able to get in touch with you. And thank you for sharing that. And you're right. I just have a couple of closeout slides to share some reminders on behalf of the conference board. First, I want to encourage you to look into some of our webcasts for March. There's one on addressing layoffs, there's one on benchmarking, one about empowering women, all in the first part of March. And you can see the website there that you can go to for more information and to register for those webcasts. Second, and those of you who have been very engaged with the conference board know that we have begun to have hubs that are very timely around current things happening in the environment. There was a hub around the global pandemic. And now we have a hub that is addressing navigating the economic storm as global recession sort of, it keeps being predicted and starting to appear around the globe. So the hub is just an aggregation of resource, and there's daily information that you can use from there that's really timely for these big unexpected things that just seem to keep hitting all of us. Next, and I think there's two more things. One is we're going mobile, and you can access TCB resources now through an app on your phone. You can get it through Google Play or the Apple App Store, and really be able to access all of the things that you do on our website, whether it's about councils, conferences, other resources, or research, all through a mobile app now. So I would encourage you to explore that. And then finally, and lastly, as you know, we have rich conferences, and one coming up in April that I want to encourage you to think about is our virtual CHRO Summit on April 26th, and you can register at the site listed here. So thanks everyone for joining us. Reed and Keily, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. Bye everyone.